seems to work. Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to say just a few words of welcome on behalf of the GSF project, Reform of Public Finance Systems in Kosovo. We're very glad to have the opportunity to welcome Mark Hallerberg from the Hertie School of Governance today for a lecture on fiscal transparency in Kosovo. Just a few words on our project and the work that we do. We support, since 2009, the Budget and Finance Committee in Parliament, and intend to expand that work to the Committee for the Oversight of Public Finance. Next to our work with relevant parliamentary committees, we work with the Kosovo Tax Administration on improving efficiency and equitability of the treatment of taxpayers. In our work, we try to look beyond sort of the very technical issues of public finance and also look at the political economy dimension, at normative dimensions. And what we try, the message that we try to get out wherever we can, is that public finance, although it has a very technical dimension, is actually also at the very core of how institutions or democratic institutions work, not only in this country but everywhere around the world. So we talk about transparency, helping sort of a good citizen-state relationship. We talk about accountability structures. Essentially, we talk about where your money is going. And because we think this message is so important, we're very delighted that we have today an opportunity such as this, where we both have, on the one hand, a professor for public management and political economy, who's very qualified to talk on the subject. And at the same time, we have an audience that's interested, and we found partners, both at the public university, at the A.U.K, the Club of Economists, that helped us organize this event today. A few words on our guest, Mark Hallerberg. Mark Hallerberg is a professor of public management and political economy at the Hertie School of Governance. However, he's also affiliated with other universities and has been in the past Emory University, the Georgia Institute for Technology, and others, and has published a vast variety of papers and also a series of books on issues revolving around public finance and how a state is financed, tax matters, etc. So I think, and we had the pleasure of exchanging on the issue of budget transparency and fiscal transparency already yesterday in the context of a bigger conference that we were able to organize. Also, Mr. Vesnik took part in this conference, and we had a good exchange on what it takes to push fiscal transparency, to push budget transparency forward, particularly in the Kosovo context. And I'm very happy, Mark Hallerberg, that you take the time to talk to us. I'm very happy about the outturn today, and also that we have this is sort of a joint event involving both the public university and the American university. And I think we look forward to a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucas. I wrote a paper for this conference that was held yesterday. And I should say for a few of you in the audience were at that conference. So what this will be is a longer version of some very brief comments I made yesterday in terms of how things are set. I work on fiscal policy, fiscal institutions, budget processes, and the like at a private university in the heart of Berlin. And in terms of my background, I've always been interested in fiscal transparency issues. I'm going to sound almost, I'm used to being, the phrase would be more positivist as an academic, thinking about how things matter. For this specific conference, I went across the line and was a bit more normative. That is, I will, even when I talk today, I'll be giving you a bit of a pitch for why fiscal transparency is a good thing. There's a literature, of course, on this. Another difference for those of you who had yesterday's I just made statements. This time I actually have some citations, because this is, of course, I'm at a university, in terms of a university setting. But I also try to fit this a bit to the context that I see here in Kosovo. But obviously, many of you are from Kosovo, and I'm not. So when it comes to the discussion period, and you see some of the things that I have here, it's following from a broader literature that has lots of cases, other places that I'm trying to take here. And I very much appreciate your comments about whether this really works in terms of how things are set. Now, I'm going to start with something that I do when I teach this, which is, this wasn't yesterday, in terms of thinking about how transparency matters and how transparency matters in the European Union context. Okay? Because you might, in most ways, maybe even too strong, there is a fairly high level of transparency in the European Union on many types of numbers. But I want to talk a bit, my favorite example comes from the Common Agricultural Policy. The Common Agricultural Policy at one point was about 70% of the European Union budget. Today it's around 35–40% of the budget. And of course, if you think about what this is, in terms of how it's set up, you know, Lucas already said that one of the good things about transparency is you have a sense of where does the money go. Now, I don't know how many of you know much about the Common Agricultural Policy, but just let me ask, who do you think, this is a transfer program to a large extent, who do you think gets the money in Europe, right? In the European Union, in the 28 member states?
The farmers.
Farmers should get the money. Okay.
Yeah.
France, I heard a country, it's interesting in terms of the responses. I got a specific group in society, I also heard about a specific country. Yes, the French like the Common Agricultural Policy. You may know in the early 60s, in fact, was one of the things that Charles de Gaulle insisted that we added as part of what was then emerging as the European community, that had to be something in agriculture. Somebody else? Any other guesses who gets the money? Well, let me show you, as best I can. There's a nice non-governmental organization that collected some data. I'm going to start in 2007 for a reason, because you'll see the data actually disappears in terms of how this goes. And the first slide will be a little hard to read, so I'll read off it, but it's meant to give you a sense of what's there. If I think about this in terms of how things are set up, one of the questions you might have is, well, what are the reporting requirements? Okay, does the European Union require all member states to report their information? And in the mid-2000s, it was a bit easier to get. This is the report for Germany that was put together. And I don't know if any of you have been to Germany. Edeka is a supermarket. The largest recipient of Common Agricultural Policy money was Edeka. It was their butcher. Okay, so the industrial plant that cuts up the animals was the largest recipient of Common Agricultural Policy money. The Land, which is the government of Schleswig-Holstein, was number 3 in terms of how this was set up. Okay, another butcher was here in terms of the list. And if you look, it's also interesting that one of the top 10 is an unknown recipient. And the name's not even there. Somebody got a fair amount of money, several €100,000, but we're not quite sure who that person was in 2007. Okay, well, you pick the biggest ones, but who else gets the money in terms of how this gets set up? Well, let me show you some pictures. Any guess of who the largest recipient of Common Agricultural Policy money was in the United Kingdom? No royalists here? Why, it's the Queen. Right? She owns a lot of land. And she got £473,000. 2008. I should say single recipient, because it turns out that the Guardian's looked into this a bit, it's a newspaper. There are others that get more, but they set it up so that they have different names. Okay, somebody might be 12 different companies that technically own a piece of land. They chop it up so it doesn't, and if you aggregate it, you'll get more than the Queen. The Queen doesn't chop up her land. Okay, you have a sense of who this is. Now, why is there a ship on it? Well, there's a ship because this Italian cruise liner exported sugar in the stomachs of its passengers as they were drinking coffee, and it got €148,000 for that. Okay, Common Agricultural Policy subsidies. Lufthansa gets money when it flies past them. Okay, I'm not taking Lufthansa tomorrow, but I'm taking a brand of Lufthansa back to Berlin. Haribo. Maybe gummy bears from Germany. Well, Haribo got €335,000. Common Agricultural Policy money. Okay? Now, I hope you go, oh, is that really the case? Of course, some farmers got it too. I'm sampling things that you wouldn't expect. Farmers also got the money. But the fact that the money is transparent and I can see what it is, means I can go look and say, okay, well, who got the money? Right? And then as a politician or as a voter, I can say, do I like this? Maybe I think it's fine that Harvard gets these subsidies. I like W. Right? There's jobs there, and they do buy agricultural products and this kind of. But I can at least make that determination. However, I can make that determination in 2008 because there was a court case in 2010 on data privacy rights. Why is it fair that the European Union tells you if I got money from the Common Agricultural Policy? That infringes on my privacy rights. Okay? So what happened is, if you look at this, several countries, but not all countries, removed the data from the website. Country I come from, Germany, 97% of the beneficiaries disappeared. Look, privacy rights. Shouldn't tell you who gets the money. Okay, they represented 72% of the total money. But that varied. In Denmark, almost very few people disappeared. You don't know what the Danes are doing on this, it's still pretty transparent. Alright? But there are other countries, Austria as well. It turned out that 9 of the 10 wealthiest people in Austria in 2008 got Common Agricultural Policy money. Maybe it's because they own very large farms. They also mostly lived in Vienna. But it's an interesting fact that very, very wealthy people were getting a lot of money from the Common Agricultural Policy. Well, now we don't know that. We know it's true in the past, but we don't know it in the present. That money it hasn't disappeared. It's still very much flowing around. It's just that we can't trace it. Okay? So that was meant as an illustration of, maybe there's something useful to this. Maybe even learn something about the Common Agricultural Policy. And I picked a place where a lot of things are transparent. And that would be, in terms of Common Agricultural Policy, something that can still be improved in terms of how things are set up. Okay? And again, you might say, well, but I looked at this and I'm picking on exceptions. In general, it worked fine. But you can do that because you have the data. So let me say a few things more about what is fiscal transparency. I gave you an illustration of it. I showed you the numbers. There's different people I can look for. But it's more than just the reporting of the numbers. The OECD, the IMF, others categorize and discuss what do we really need in terms of how things go. The definition that I like is this one that's here. And just to read, I don't usually like to read things off slides, it's just one sentence. You know, the comprehensiveness, clarity, reliability, timeliness, relevance of public reporting, past, present, future. So, timing, I want to know what happened yesterday, I want to know what happened in Parliament today maybe, if there was any, I don't know if there's anything on money today, but there could have been. I want to know in the future. Future means I want to know something about forecasts. What am I assuming in the future? What do I want to do in it? I want those numbers to be reliable, if possible. Belgium in the 1980s, for example, printed a lot of things about how much they were spending on education in wonderfully detailed medium-term financial framework that turned out to have no relation to reality. Yeah, they promised they'd make cuts, they spent a lot more. Okay? Wasn't particularly useful. Comprehensiveness. If you look, I'm going to show you some interesting information in terms of fiscal transparency into spending. Well, and I'm going to show you some NGOs that do some of this kind of work. If you compare Germany and Russia, Russia looks like it's more transparent than Germany. But there's an issue. The Russians do this only on the spending side. The revenue side is a mystery. Where the money comes from, okay, who gets taxed, who pays what, that's very, very nebulous. So if you want to get something in Russia, it's often very useful to get something on the tax side instead of on the spending side. Well, that gets the comprehensiveness. Okay, there are holes. Some things look very nice. They look even very nice for international organizations, but there are other things that don't look so nice. You want something that's comprehensive if you're going to have fiscal transparency. And of course, timeliness. Argentina is a country that reported really good figures, but always 3 years late. Oh, we just get the budgets right now for 2012. Well, that's nice. I mean, if there's a problem or something that didn't work well, how can I make any change? How can I suggest to do something different? In fact, there's a different Congress that was in session there. Right? It's old. You want the information to be timely. You want it to be reliable, and you want it to cover lots of things. Now, how this has evolved, by the way, if you are interested in sort of following the international organizational trail on this, the IMF has a code of transparency that I give you the definition for. They go and they do missions, and they'll check out how transparent you are. And this past year, they changed isn't quite, well, they changed it, but they didn't necessarily scrap the old way of thinking about what are the numbers. Okay, that's what I showed you for the Common Agricultural Policy. What they did is they added on top of that two things. One is to think a bit about what's happening in terms of risks. Okay, what is the risk that the economy will be worse in Kosovo next year than what you expect? Okay. What is the risk that salaries will be, again, 25% higher next year than they were this past year? Okay. These are things that should be incorporated and discussed. Okay. How robust are your numbers? How do things change given different assumptions? A positive shock, by the way, could be a good thing. Oil prices are dropping in most of the world. And for some countries, that's a wonderful thing. It'll lead to more economic growth. If you're in Venezuela, it's a bad thing. Okay, they rely on oil for most of their revenue, and if you look at the predictions of will the Venezuelan government default in the next month or two, those predictions keep getting higher and higher because the oil price keeps staying low. And these are examples of shocks. And the suggestion of fiscal transparency isn't just showing you the numbers, it's thinking a bit more about, well, how reliable are these numbers? Making that phrase, reliability. And that means you have to say something about risks. Another thing, however, that the fund talked about that I would agree is a very good idea is not just who gets the information, not just who produces the information, or is there information, but then who does something with the information. And that's getting to this idea of having accountability institution. And I give you an example here, which is from Sweden, and I pick it intentionally because it illustrates a few things. And if you were to ask who does the audits or who follows things, who's the supreme audit institution in the Swedish case, well, there is a European Court of Auditors. So some things in Sweden will be investigated if the money came from the European Union. If it's domestic, it's a Swedish National Audit Office. And you might then ask, well, where is it located? Well, it's located in the Swedish Parliament. Indeed. So there are other precedents in the European Union where you have an accountability body that's based within Parliament. Now what's it do? Well, it reports on financial matters, like I did for the Common Agricultural Policy, the money going where the money is allocated, and it has a performance component. Not just how much are Swedes spending on schools, but how well educated are the students. Okay, are you getting value for money? Would be another phrase. And this audit institution does both. Issues reports pretty consistent. Now, one idea is accountability institutions, if we think about what are these, I gave you one example of an audit institution. There are, of course, others. This was also a topic indeed at yesterday's conference, thinking about the role of parliaments. Here's a stock photo of the Bundestag in Germany, how this is set. But you can think about, well, what role can parliaments play? Parliaments can play a sort of watchdog. They can investigate the way the government spent the money, in terms of how things are spent. They can also investigate what the plans are. And one key part of accountability is when what you plan varies from what the reality is, you may want to investigate why is that the case. So if you have a budget rule that says that you have a deficit of 2%, and your deficit is almost double that, you can imagine the role for Parliament is to say, well, why? There may be reasons. There are reasons. They may be good or bad. But the idea is that you have some sort of body that checks. Giving you some examples from Europe. If you think about the way multi-annual plans function, I did, in fact, a survey of all European parliaments. Also checked European parliamentary committees to see what do they do today in terms of monitoring economic governance. And something that says about 2/3 of parliaments debate what happens in terms of multi-annual plans for the government. And you may know that governments are required to submit what are known as convergence or stability programs to Brussels every year. And about 2/3 of parliaments have committees that debate before that document goes out, before that document goes to Brussels, okay, what the government is planning. There's one other little piece of that I have here that I think is room for improvement within Europe, is that very few parliaments debate what the European Commission says about that document. Okay, in terms of how to do that. That is, you submit something to Brussels, Brussels writes a report and says you should maybe improve your budget deficit, or if you're France, you should have a pension reform. And then the question is, does that get back to the national level? And the punchline is essentially, if you're out of the Eurozone, you tend to have additional hearings. If you're within the Eurozone, you tend to ignore it. So that's, I can talk about that question and answer if you're interested. The basic idea, though, is that there's a lot of monitoring, and that even today, within many European Union countries, Parliament plays this type of role. Well, this isn't the only thing that's possible. There are also fiscal councils. How many of you have heard this phrase? But the idea of a fiscal council is you create an independent watchdog. It's not based in the audit office, it's not based in Parliament, but it's usually a standalone institution. The original ones in the European Union were in Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The Netherlands got the most famous one, the so-called Central Planning Bureau. They've been around for decades. But as of 2013, all European Union member states are required to create one. Now, how they create it, that's more, this phrase subsidiarity, it's more up to the national level, how to do it. But you have to set something up. Okay? This isn't just a Europe matter. Outside of Europe, the Australian Budget Office, Parliament has this. This South Africans have been setting one up this past summer. I was in Pretoria in September, in fact. I heard about some of the ways that they're getting this in form. The most famous one probably is the American Congressional Budget Office. That is a huge staff. I think 260 people work for this thing. And it issues lots and lots of reports. But the idea is that you have some sort of body that, again, checks what the government is doing. If I think about its objectives, I already mentioned the watchdog function, but there's often a strong role for fiscal forecasts. So the government says next year we'll have 3% growth, our deficit will go to 0. Is that realistic? Is that something that really happened? Well, the watchdog writes a report, usually has at least a little bit of a staff to do so. It's often, in fact, it's always headed in the European case by somebody from the country itself. But I give the Portuguese example, it's got a body of 5 who sit on there. It's got some economists here, it's got several economists who sit on this sort of panel. And again, the idea is to check on the credibility of the government plan. I should add something else on this is, in terms of how this works, sometimes people say, well, this body's there to be quote-unquote against the government. And I would say, no, that's not the case. What you often get is if the government knows it's going to have its numbers checked in the first place, the government tends to have better forecasts. And this paper documents this in some detail. So that the government itself can say, well, we think the deficit will be 3%. And you know what? We probably have a better estimate because we know we're going to be watched. And the watchdog says that's the case. And then that enhances my credibility with the population and with markets and other sorts of actors. Okay? But this Portuguese is one of the newer ones. It's one that works very well, I think, so far in terms of how things are set up. And it discusses things with what happens with market. All right, that's not the only thing. Again, what's my theme? If I've lost you, my theme is accountability institutions. What sort of role do they play? And note that transparency is not just the numbers. Okay, it's also the institutions. Who's behind these institutions? Who does this? And indeed, there's civil society groups that do this too. I mentioned here something that's quite new called the Open Government Partnership Initiative that brings together civil society groups in a country with the government, and both have to cooperate with one another in terms of developing some sort of action plan. Okay, if you develop an action plan, it can be part of the process. I give you an example from a neighboring country that's already doing this. Albania, they committed to joining this in 2011, prepared an action plan in 2012. It has an open government declaration that states how it wants to move forward with making its government more transparent, and these are from its action plan. Okay, it wants to increase public integrity, improve public services, and be more efficient in managing public resources. Okay? So it's something that involves very consciously the national government and civil society groups within a specific country. Right. And it's a framework. Now, this is where I give you positivist studies, that is, people check these things, but I'm going to sound a bit normative in terms of giving you a pitch for why transparency is good, in terms of how this is set. But I'm going to give you a little bit of background about why you might think this is a good thing. You know, the obvious one, of course, is tricks. If you can't see the tricks, there may be more tricks. And there are studies that look to see what sorts of accounting maneuvers happen, that if they're public and they're seen, they're less likely to happen in the first place. Countries that have higher fiscal transparency tend to have lower budget deficits. They tend to have lower debt levels. They also tend to have, in terms of electoral cycles, there may be a phenomenon where the government decides just before an election to raise salaries, or do something in schools, or in the Greek case, that's one of my favorite ones, in Greece they tend not to collect taxes. Okay, for 30 years, I can just look on tax collections, okay, over a 30-year period, and I can just see the way the thing's moving when there's an election. Because they always drop in an election year. This time, of course, there's an election Sunday in Greece, and it was a short election, and they're also on a program. So I haven't looked at the recent tax collection records. My prior is that this time will be one of the few times where I wouldn't be able to tell in terms of how these things run. But in general, you can tell. Okay? And the idea is if you can see it, and I said I can see it in terms of the aggregate numbers, but you can't see it in live time. And the Greeks in the past were not all that transparent about some of these numbers. Okay, it's more likely that you manipulate prior to an election. I already mentioned this idea of fiscal gimmicks. This is a very recent paper, the Altlass and Beta paper, that looked at a wide variety of European Union countries and showed that if you see kind of some of they documented certain types of tricks that are reported to the IMF, and countries that were less transparent relied more on these types of tricks to balance those. I said it's good for budgeting, it's good for macroeconomic policy. Okay, this is going to be on the budget. Hopefully, your forecasts are better. Okay, things are more, if the assumptions are more transparent, you and I as an academic can look and say, well, I don't like your model. Okay, I think your assumptions are wrong. Or why do you think inflation has that effect on economic growth? And I can just ask you. Maybe it's very reasonable, and maybe reasonable people can differ on the answers to these questions. But the hope is if things are very open and transparent, I can see this and we can have that discussion. And hopefully these sorts of estimates get better over time. There is an issue that in terms of you want money. If you go abroad and you want cash as the public sector, if markets have greater faith in your numbers, you don't have to pay as much in interest costs. Right? Because they say, well, we believe you. Okay? There's not going to be a surprise. Or if there is a surprise, it's going to be because you had a flood or natural disaster or something bad happened to you, something none of us could anticipate. Right? Now, I said, what if you want money for the government? And there are even some studies that look at foreign direct investment and say that, well, if capitalists abroad look and they want to invest in your country, and they say, but I'm not sure if I can trust the government. And if the government is very transparent about what it does, that increases the trust and the faith in the government itself. Okay, so I'm more likely to invest in countries that are very open. Everything's closed, and I don't really know where the money goes. That's a problem. Right? So it affects the economy. It's not just a budget issue, it's also an economic issue. You can think about this too in terms of democracy. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, 1789, believe it or not, talks about fiscal transparency. People have a right to know what the governments are doing. I'm not a lawyer, that's how things go, but the idea that it's a basic right of a democracy is something that's got tradition. Right? And again, not just budget issue. You can hold, of course, citizens accountable, you know what they're doing, you know what the government's doing, and there is some evidence that increasing transparency reduces corruption. Which would make a lot of sense, right? Because often the corrupt things are things you don't want the public to know about. If it's easy for the public to know what you're doing, you're going to be less corrupt. Now, where do you get transparency? Well, I'll show you a little bit some data that's worldwide. You can measure these things across lots of countries. And the punchline is fairly simple. Democracies tend to be more transparent than autocracies. It should be kind of intuitive. But one thing that I notice, especially young democracies, countries that are moving from being something else to a democracy, that in that transition period, you tend to have an increase in fiscal transparency. What I've seen as an outsider so far here in Kosovo is I've seen something similar, but clearly things have gotten better in the last 6 years in terms of the level of transparency. And I guess I would stress that it's a process. Okay, there may be a lot of progress, but even more can be done. And it is common for new democracies to be increasing their transparency. One other issue about this is the role of competition. That political parties competing with one another, that tends to be the dynamic. It's not just that you vote, it's that you have competitive elections. That implies some sort of punishment, that if the public finds out about something, okay, the public can then do something. If it's a one-party state that has elections, but if you don't get any rotation, you don't tend to have a change. All right, how do you measure this? Well, I already gave you some intuition. This is a little more academic than what I talked about yesterday, because it's one of the questions of how do you operationalize your variable, be another way of phrasing this, right? Well, more information in fewer documents. Right? We published it, but it was in 5,000 different documents. Kind of nice, but where are they? I mean, you know, I'd like to have that information in something I can readily gather. Independent verification. I've talked a little bit already about accountability institutions and independence. You see this here as well. Non-arbitrary language. You don't have to move to accrual accounting, but it may make some things more transparent than the standard cash-based accounting. Already mentioned the IMF line on this, but it's not just IMF. The idea that you want things on future spending too. I don't know if you know this phrase, but it's a common one in budgeting. It's called the camel's nose. Okay, the camel's nose is that you propose something, and in the budget all that shows up is the nose. But if you look in the future, you realize it's like the nose sticking out of, like these curtains. And you look in future years, there's a big camel back there. Okay, that is the cost getting really high in future years. But all you see when you pass it is the nose, but you buy the whole camel with your first allocation of money. The idea is if you have multi-annual budgets, you can look and say, okay, that little program this year is going to get really big next year. Right? And you're more I want to see that whole camel. I don't want to just see its nose. And I only see that if I see a little camel. Now, one other thing I'm going to show you is this one other international group I'll point out is the Open Budget Initiative. They, every 2 years, usually, they go and they measure, okay, how transparent are countries. Now, how do they do it? Well, it's not actually, they collate the data. There's usually a civil society group based in a country that tries to gather this different information on 106 different questions. Now, in countries that have no issue with democracy and with having civil society groups do this, you can go on the webpage and see who does this. For China, for Saudi Arabia, a few other countries, they're not listed who provided the information. But I can tell you, I know some of the people who've done this, it's legit. I mean, they do talk to people who try to organize these things. They also have others who double check the numbers. So it's not just the agenda of some society group, there are others that are doing this. But the point is you can look at this and you can compare, take these numbers, and get some interesting perspectives. If you're thinking about Kosovo, you can think about benchmarking yourself relative to other countries. Right? So this is their map. Very nice, colorful map. I don't know why blue is the highest, but blue is the highest. Their scores are 81 to 100. And if you see what places are the most transparent, well, they're in Scandinavia, UK, France, South Africa, and New Zealand. Now, I was going to say South Africa, you realize it's not just based on how wealthy you are. Although South Africa is wealthy relative to some other African countries, it's still poor relative to much of the rest of the world. If you look at this, but those are sort of the ones that do quite well. If you look at sort of the green's pretty good. That's much of the rest of Europe. Notice I said before, Russia looks pretty good on these numbers. Again, a lot of this is based on the expenditure side. So some of the things that aren't quite comprehensive there, I think that's where some of the issues. And then you see red. I mentioned already Saudi Arabia and China are places that don't have much fiscal transparency. There's some countries in Africa where this is the case too. And of course yellow are the countries that have some, but have some room for improvement. So this would include, say, Italy, which may not be much of a surprise to somebody. It's there, they have some transparency, but they could do better. Now, again, I think Albania is a country nearby that has done this as well. And you'll see, the other nice thing is because it's done every couple of years, you can see the evolution. And it was quite intransparent in 2006, but Albania has made consistent progress over time in terms of opening these books. And I mentioned already something that Albania did in 2011 in terms of pledging to open its government. And at least seems, they're not the same organizations, right? It did this. It seems that this other one has documented that there was an improvement in 2012. If I look at the region, I zoomed up the map and I typed in the numbers to give you a sense of things. I should say so far there has not been such a report for Kosovo. Okay, but you can see sort of, if you look in the region around, I mentioned that Albania had increased its numbers. Macedonia is quite low in terms of level of transparency. Bulgaria is pretty high. Bulgaria is a European member state, but Romania is lower, and indeed Romania went backwards. It was around the early 60s in terms of its number and when it joined the European Union, and then it has been cutting back its fiscal transparency ever since. Every new report gets worse in terms of how these things go. And I mentioned that because this is something that it's not, oh, I've got transparency. Everything stays the same. These are things that can be changed in terms of how things are set. Now, I'm almost done when I get to Kosovo, but some things that are looked at sort of basic building blocks. The Open Budget Initiative now has a pilot project for 30 countries where they update monthly, not every 2 years, but monthly, how countries are doing. And they take the OECD best practices as the main thing. So they only look at 8 or 9 questions, but things like, do you have medium-term projections in your comprehensive budget? Do you have a pre-budget report? Monthly reports, mid-year report? These are more on the reporting items as opposed to the accountability items. But it's another way of thinking about how would you get adequacy. And the goal is to have something a bit more dynamic. So you can see if things start to go bad in a certain country, you can see it happen rather quickly. Like for example, Egypt is a country that they've looked at a lot. There's been a change in government in Egypt, and there have been concerns about the level of transparency under the government, and you can go online every month, see how that has evolved. Now what about Kosovo? This is now, I was before on, I'd say thicker ice, but I'm an academic. It could be some of you don't like transparency, you'll give me studies that say, no, it's a terrible thing. I kind of doubt that. I think my ice was pretty thick, I think it's pretty safe. But now I'm on thinner ice because I'm in your country, and I'm going to give you some suggestions and some ideas based on what I have seen. But I'd love to hear your comments and say if you think this sort of thing work. If you'd say, well, first of all, there has been real progress in terms of how things are set. A lot of the basic framework does seem to be in place. If I think about things that could be improved, and this is based partly on some secondary literature, but also talking with some people, one of the basic issues is simply in terms of the reporting is bureaucratic capacities. Also the theme yesterday. Okay, do you have the ability to create the numbers? That hasn't been improved a lot in the last few years. But there are discussions of this sort of strategic plan for beefing this up by 2017, and the question is, you know, will this need to be implemented? Does it need to be augmented under a new government, that kind of thing? But it's a basic building block. It's not exciting, okay, build capacity and bureaucracy, but it's something that has to be done in order to get this to work. Something else is thinking about existing accountability institutions in Kosovo. You know, the Budget and Finance Committee does review quarterly reports, but from what I've heard talking to people is they get multi-annual reports, but they kind of get them and say, yes, that's nice. Hey, we got it. In terms of really evaluating, going through them, what's realistic, what's not, that would be quite useful. The Parliamentary Committee for Oversight of Public Finances is in flux, it's developing, and I encourage it to be a true audit institution of Parliament. The National Audit Office, this is another player that's a bit in flux from what I've been told. It should be a legitimate player, one that's strengthened. And I think a theme that came up that was interesting yesterday was the cooperation among them. I mean, they're not competitors. Okay, it should be, oh, I get this. There shouldn't be turf battles. There should be, how do we work together? And indeed, one of the things that came out yesterday was how, at least in the German context, you have an oversight committee in Parliament that works with the audit office. And they tend to go back and forth, and they see themselves very much as allies. And they feel that they can scrutinize things much better precisely because they are based in different places, and that they can function. If I think about a fiscal council, I've heard mixed responses on this idea, but I talked to you about what one is. Again, this idea of some sort of watchdog. The reason why the fiscal watchdog was created in Australia was that the government had great numbers. The government would then call a snap election, okay, and the election 4 weeks from now, the opposition would come and say, well, we've got a tax plan, okay, we're going to cut taxes. And then they make a mistake in terms of the implications of it. All right, well, you might think that's kind of natural, right? All of a sudden there's an election, you come up with a platform, but they didn't have the capacity to do a good analysis. And so there was a sense the government always had the advantage over the opposition. Okay, and I hope you see sort of the logic of that. So they created a body that collected this type of information. They could do the analysis in Parliament, so that at any time you can be also government party, but you can be an opposition party, and you can go to this office and you can say, well, what are the implications of my plan? Well, you can broaden this. It may be that, and this is the case in South Africa and some other places too, most of the capacity is in the government. Okay, and to have the ability to check what the government's doing, it's useful to have some sort of independent body that can do this. This body often plays a role, like in the Dutch case, with the press. So if the government comes and promises that it's going to increase spending by 25% on education, well, it can be useful to have the Dutch Fiscal Council say, well, this is what it means for the budget. Okay, independent of the government. The government might say something, this is what it affects them. Now again, sometimes the council might reinforce what the government says. It's not always the case that the council is against that. The question is, would that be useful here? And I've heard one concern yesterday came up was in terms of how many independent institutions are there? Will these things be staffed? Will they be value for money? Will they really do what they need to do? But if you think one of the issues isn't just, do I have the capacity to produce numbers, but rather it's something about, well, these estimates, right? I need a voice in the public that can talk about what the effects are of decisions governments are taking and highlight certain things. That helps to keep the government more accountable, and maybe you do need something along these lines. Okay. Now, the final thing is thinking again about the role of civil society actors. You can think there is this letter of intent to join the Open Government Partnership initiative that I found. I haven't seen it put in place, and I contrast that very much with Albania, which also signed a letter of intent and then did it. Well, you've got a new government. You do have some civil society organizations that might be interested in doing something like this. I could see this as being an easy step. And there's a framework, 65 countries have already done this, okay, including some in the region, and a sort of blueprint for how to do things. So it's not technically column. Okay. And finally, this open budget survey, the next one's going to be in 2015. For whatever reason, this will be the first time. It won't be every 2 years. This won't be 3. But it would sure be nice to have a comparison. And there may be some things that, what I can see here, in fact, some things that are done quite well. You can pick that up, but you can also see by benchmarking yourself with others, other sorts of things can be done. So, I hope I didn't lose you. I hope you got a sense of what is fiscal transparency, why it might be a good thing, what sorts of accountability institutions exist, and I gave some standard implications for the Kosovo or the Kosovo seat. I very much appreciate any comments or questions that you might have. Please.
Hi. I have a couple of either questions or comments. So one at the beginning and one at the end here. You talked about the common agricultural policy in the EU, and I know that was just as an example.
That was, yes.
Yes. And then you talked about Then you talked about how in 2010, I believe, the EU Data Protection Act said that they shouldn't have to be so transparent.
Yes.
And then the suggestion for Kosovo is that they should be more transparent. Would you anticipate government saying, well, if the EU says that, then we should, align with the EU and be less transparent? That's the first.
Okay.
And then you talked about the introduction of fiscal councils. Recently, Shinzo Abe in Japan had a snap election, which he thought was going to win. Do they have a fiscal council over there?
My understanding is in Japan, no, and also the central bank is not particularly politically independent. That's another body that sometimes plays a bit of this type of role that does not in the Japanese case. So that one's easy. On the first one, I gave that example part to Needle to say that not everybody's perfect when you think about what fiscal transparency is. On the positive side, the European Union, of course, requires fiscal plans that they're actually 5 years. They go back 1 year, they go forward 3 years, and they include the current year. And you always have to submit these things at the European member state. And there are lots of regulations about what type of information needs to be in those. And so I think in terms of fiscal transparency, in general, the EU is a good thing for fiscal transparency. It pulls up countries throughout Europe. Having said that, I also try to illustrate it's not just, oh, you join the EU and everything's good. I also want to mention that in Romania things have gone backwards. But they can only go backwards so far, because at some point they still have to make the reports to the European Commission. And one thing we heard yesterday is I guess Kosovo is about to submit one of these plans to the European Commission for the first time. That's the understanding I have in terms of how these things run. He never gave the name of it. They used to be called pre-accession economic programs. They now have, I guess, some other term for what they are. But the basic idea is that there should be something that talks about what your plans are for the future. And the question I had in that context was, well, most European member states, that goes to Parliament, and Parliament debates it. And my understanding is that Parliament may not have even known about that document, how things are said. So, what I'm getting at is I think the EU in most cases helps to shine the flashlight, but of course there are cases like common agricultural policy where that's not true.
Thank you.
Get this out.
I was wondering about transparency in Europe, and particularly, as I saw yesterday, Mario Draghi's decision to implement quantitative easing in Europe, and so it will be a huge cash inflow in Europe, even in those countries who scored less on transparency, such as Spain, Italy, or even countries such as Greece who have a low data. So I would want to know your personal opinion on that. Should there be an international watchdog on that, and how should fiscal transparency be better on that?
Well, from what I have seen so far, the ECB will be transparent in how it spends the money. So we know that it will be buying government bonds.
Yes, certainly, but I mean, in the individual states.
Well, the bonds that they buy from individual states will know what that is. So I think that is going to be part of what's there. If you want to pick on transparency in the European Central Bank, I'm going a little beyond your question, but you may know that there's been an issue about the minutes being published, how detailed are the minutes and things like this. And that's something that's ongoing, that's something that's evolved. In the early years, because you're supposed to worry about your Eurozone economics and not, let's say, French economics. And they were concerned that the French central banker would vote for France if everything would be public. Right? Then they said, well, let's keep it secret. But they've been moving towards more transparency. And indeed, Mr. Draghi yesterday, they asked him what the vote was. And he said it was so overwhelming there was no need to take a vote. So apparently there wasn't a vote. Why do I say that? Because it shows, the idea, if you get more transparency, let's say you had all the records, that may change behavior. And then you want to think about what that means. So anyway, I hope I got a little bit of your question, because you were addressing specifically to EC.
Thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. I have 3 questions.
Okay.
One is, you mentioned in the definition of transparency, IMF definition of transparency, about the timeliness. And we have been having, the Ministry of Finance in Kosovo has been publishing the data in PDF file. Maybe this is just a technical issue, but for civil society to analyze the numbers, in order to put the data from PDF to Excel file to calculate, to know if they did the calculation right, it's taking almost a week to do the calculation. So do you think that violates the timeliness in terms of transparency? And another issue is the wages in Kosovo. We have been having a lot of issues with wages. Wages have been changing in the middle of the fiscal year. They have not been forecasted. And do you think, I know it was discussed yesterday at the conference that maybe we should have a wage policy or wage rule that wages cannot be changed unless discussed before the budget is approved at the parliament. And the third question is, the parliament has only 2 months, sometimes even less, to discuss the budget before it is approved. Do you think this is enough time for the parliament to discuss all and do the fiscal risks and everything before it is approved? Thank you.
So if I take this backwards, I guess this came up yesterday, the 2 months, I think there was a consensus that I even identified in terms of the summary, that, 2 months is just a very quick time. The most recent budget, of course, the government was formed so late, that was what, a week, I guess, is what I understand. That was very fast. It wasn't time for any sort of oversight. But there's usually a trade-off. You don't want it so early. It was also discussed in the German budget is in July. Having said that, I've seen, yes, they propose it in July, but then they have debates in September. And there are 3 readings in September. It really is more 3 months instead of 6. You have something that's 6, that's nice, but the budget evolves. So I think 3 months probably is realistic. If it gets to be too long ahead of time, you'll just be changing the numbers because some assumptions may be changing. So that part I find very reasonable. Your first question was about the data accessibility. Is it a technical issue? In some sense, yes. At first, if the data is available at all in PDF, that's at least a start. I agree, however, that the more accessible it is, the easier it is to use. And ideally, it would be in a format that would be very easy for you or others to check. So it would be an improvement to move to Excel if possible. I mentioned the Common Agricultural Policy. This was also one of the complaints, actually, that NGO had for the CAP, because even there was a requirement at one point that you had to release data. Some countries, like the UK, put it up in a way that was XML, and you could just write a little program and pull everything off and say. Okay? The German government posted everything in PDFs, and they put on a type of coding so you couldn't just read, you'd actually have to hand type it. Okay, they locked it so you couldn't pull the data off. And I talked to the guy who did this, and he was just really angry with the German government. So it's just, there's too much, I can't get it. I have to hire all these people. I'm a rural NGO, I don't have much money to do this. And so they, of course, propose that you set it up so it's all in a common format, but then they got the legislation and said, well, now you don't have to report it. And so then it disappeared. Okay, but that follows up on what you suggest. It would be easier. That would be one of the things I think to discuss. I missed your second one?
Wages.
Wages. Well, ideally, those big items are part of one budget document that's considered at one time. And this gets to an issue about transparency, but also about how budgets are made. Sometimes budgets look really nice the first time they're presented, but then every month afterwards there's a new budget or a new addition, and then that undermines the integrity of the whole budget process. So sure, I mean, on wages, you would hope that they would be set at the same time the budget sets, that you can include the overall cost. Please.
Can I just explain regarding PDF?
Yeah.
In 2012 was the last time when government sent PDF and also Excel. We put Excel tables, and then after that, you cannot find any more Excel tables of the budget.
So they had already started to do it, and then they changed back.
Yes, they changed back. I think that we have a case of like Romania regarding the budget tables. So on purpose, they don't publish anymore in Excel because it takes time more for calculating and people to tell what is wrong. So they use this as a trick.
Thank you for the presentation, first of all. I want to know your opinion about the transparency governments nowadays, exactly in Kosovo, including the role of civil society and the Commission of Parliament in Kosovo. What do you think what is happening in reality? Do we have any transparency from the government, or do we have only the contract or corporation that the government try to manipulate their civil society and the parliament?
I should be very honest. I don't have enough background to accuse the government of manipulating. I just don't know. I mean, I can't make that judgment. I can say that some of the things that I have here are institutional things that I can measure and I can see. And again, as an academic, I like the things I can measure. And I can say this is sort of a certain level of transparency. I can see it's better than some other countries. Some other countries also I've worked in terms of how things are set. I can see there are clear things that could be improved. And that's where these suggestions I think come from. One other part of this, it's come from some recent discussions, is of course, this is just the first step. You need to have people who are committed to using the information. One thing I think that was the lesson that comes from Parliament. The government does do what it's supposed to do. It submits the plan. But you need to then have people who check it. Now, the people in Parliament might say, I don't have the capacities. How do I do this? Well, I don't have the training. I don't have the staff. But then we can look a little deeper and say, well, then how would we improve these things, if that's what the real issue is? So I think some of the mechanisms are there, but again, you need some political will. And that's also one of the things why I mentioned a little bit, this idea of the fiscal council, where if you have somebody who can give an independent opinion in terms of how this is set, that might help reinforce some of the mechanisms that are already there. There can be mechanisms of auditing, there can be mechanisms in Parliament.
Thank you. My name is Deridan, and I was just wondering a word or two about fiscal sustainability in Kosovo. How do we basically tie government's hands to not increase wages just before every elections? And then how do we make sure that the projections that they have, macroeconomic projections, are accurate actually? Because we have the medium-term expenditure framework, but I don't know if it actually takes into account the falling oil prices that has happened in the past few months and what that does to inflation and economic growth.
So that's also where, in terms of, where is it? That's why it's important to update them. I don't think anybody foresaw what was going to happen with oil prices. And that's really been fast. Another one, you, like I, have euros in your pocket. I happen to be American and spend some time in the US. I had no idea that my euro was going to weaken so much against the dollar. I'm not particularly happy about that, I should add. From a personal perspective. I won't put my whole. Anyway, the point is there are shocks, there are changes. And it's one of the reasons why I made this idea of a midterm report. Well, how have things happened? It turns out we've had to pay a lot less in oil than we expected. Okay, what do we do with that? Does it just simply get spent on something else? Does it get saved? You know, there are decisions that should be taken, and that should be transparent. Also, if it turns out unemployment's much higher than expected, and you have unemployment benefits, well, okay, and these things are more automatic. Well, where's that, you know, do we need to make adjustments in other part of the budget? Which gets to your first part of the question, which is about sustainability. You know, if you have a nice macro framework that is flexible and it's transparent, and I can see how these different changes are at least affecting what I'm anticipating, I can then say, well, is it still sustainable? And if it's not, I have to do something about it. And by the way, governments, one of the big issues is their relationship with markets. Because if you're going to run a deficit, you have to borrow. And you have to borrow from somebody. Okay, in terms of how this is set up. A country like Argentina, when it defaulted in 2001, ever since then, it's had to run surpluses. No one wants to give it money. Okay, so it changes things very, you know, in terms of sustainability. It has to be sustainable. You just can't get money anyplace else. And so I think there's a relationship between, you know, if you think about what it means to be fiscally transparent and what sorts of outcomes you get on sustainability, I think this is one of the mechanisms why these countries tend to be more sustainable. Yeah, please.
If I may, another question. Do you think that Kosovo should enter into new IMF arrangements just so that, you know, as a citizen, I'm sure that the government is fiscally responsible?
That's an excellent question that I'm not placed to answer. Okay, I'm not from the IMF. Well, the IMF wouldn't tell you that anyway. But clearly, sometimes if you're under a program, the IMF can help provide a type of discipline. Whether that Kosovo today should do that, weighing the benefits and the costs, I can't make that calculation. The question I have, though, is it might be that the IMF helps to provide that independent role, but only when you're under a standby agreement. And if you think what's important is that you have an independent institute, you know, some independent voice, it doesn't have to be that's there. Does it always have to be the fund? You know, there are some advantages for it to be the IMF. There are some disadvantages for it to be the IMF. One question too is domestic legitimacy. That's another reason why I'm nervous about answering your question. I don't know what the public here thinks of the IMF. I've been in countries where they think the IMF is the good cop, you know, kind of yells at us and is the bad cop sometimes, but in general, it helps us not commit crimes, so we see it that way. Others say it comes and imposes austerity, it leads to poverty, it's a terrible thing. It's a political institution in some ways, and to say bringing in the IMF is a quote-unquote good thing, without knowing the context, I don't want to answer that. But I think what I'm also trying to get at is, if you have somebody that provides that role domestically, and somebody who speaks Albanian, who's giving you, you know, and who's trusted as being independent from political parties, they can provide a little bit of that role that maybe you're looking for the IMF, in the IMF. Anything else? Yes, please.
I think that Yeridan mentioned the capacities to make forecasts and the fiscal sustainability. He was not very much worried with the problems of positive or negative fiscal shocks. But with the way that the government simply doesn't care what numbers they put there. For example, in the current projections for the next year, we see a 5% growth, although all organizations assume that the growth will not exceed 3%.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if the Prime Minister tells you the economy will grow at 5%, but unemployment will shrink at 7%, it clearly shows the lack of fundamental or basic knowledge of economics, because you're assuming that you are growing with a reduction in productivity, so, which makes no sense. Or another drastic case is when they revise their economic growth rate and then the projection about GDP increases. they show higher GDP at a lower growth rate, which makes no sense.
No, that doesn't make any sense at all.
Well,
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense, but they don't care because they put the projections at the very last pages of the 430 pages document, assuming that nobody will read them. Not even they read those projections. Is the very at the beginning they will start with the world economy, world outlook, and people get bored on the second page, and this is how they get rid of it. So nobody has even looked at these numbers. And even if you ask the director of the budget, how can it be that your projection about the growth rate goes down and the number of GDP goes up? It's, oh, you have to ask the minister because the minister says, I like this number, put this number there. So this is the kind of quality of projections and the risk of fiscal insustainability that I assume the leader was looking at. And about the fiscal council, we have something that we call the fiscal council, actually fiscal and economic council.
Okay.
But the terms of reference are completely different. It's a group
It could
of,
be called something else. I mean,
a
I
group of
understand.
people consisting of ministers,
Yeah.
chambers of commerce, trade unions, but with completely different goals and objectives.
Yeah, sure. No, the idea is to have somebody, though, you said who's going to read the 430 pages? The proposal is to have somebody who does it consistently, and that's the job. And somebody who's, when you talk about economic knowledge, I mean, it does tend to have economists on the councils. Okay, somebody who's got backgrounds in terms of looking at these sorts of things. And it sounds like, though, it's transparent enough that you can see those problems right now. Right? You can at least identify that there are some governments, of course, it would just be the number, it wouldn't even be the 430 pages to get through it. But the hope is that you have some way to monitor this, and then again, somebody who's credible to say, well, that just doesn't add up. And then I guess the next question is, what's the punishment? To be rather direct. Well, the punishment could be in the press. It could be moral suasion and trying to convince you that this doesn't make sense. But I also mentioned, I mean, that some of the benefits of fiscal transparency, I think markets, is it going to cost more with these sorts of things? The Fitch, Moody's and others, they send people to different countries, they snoop around. And if they go to a true council, and Moody's goes to the council says this isn't going to work, okay, maybe the government doesn't listen, but suddenly they have to pay a lot more for what they borrow, then they might listen. Okay, then there might be a real consequence. And I know people who are on fiscal councils, and the rating agencies go to them all the time. Now, you might not like that. Some people don't like rating agencies. But the point is that there's actually a real role for something along those lines. It can also be, of course, the role of parliamentary committees, in terms of bringing these things up. You then need the staff and the support to be able to do this. But that is also an opportunity to review these things. As you said, why is it this way? And that's where Parliament can play an accountability. All right, well, thank you very much for coming.